What I call transgender ink deserves to be highlighted in a very visible way.
Why?
Sex reassignment surgeries and hormone replacement therapies are a combined value of $2.94 billion. By 2030, it would increase to $7.5 billion. There are no long-term studies that show the efficacy of taking these very powerful pharmaceuticals. One of the most graphic and invasive procedures is a vaginoplasty. That is where male to female patient is castrated, testicles are removed, and the penis is inverted to create a vaginal cavity.
They can't even do lip filler in a convincing way in this country. You can't tell me they can recreate something as complex as female genitalia.
The Biden administration has kind of tacitly endorsed reconstructive surgery for minors.
The child will often know that they are transgender from the moment that they have any ability to express themselves.
There's 300,000 transgender youth. That number has, by the way, doubled over 5 years. They face a lifetime of zero sexual function.
It's almost too crazy.
It's perverse.
If someone had told you 15 years ago that kids in your, say, daughter's 9th grade class would be coming to school in drag and would be affirmed in that by their teachers and the broader community, you would say there's no chance that could happen in this country. And of course, it has happened, and it's now happening at scale. Transgenderism is not just a fad, it's a fact of life across this country, not just the elites, but in small towns, everywhere. And so the question is, how did something this unnatural and prima facie demented happen so quickly? Well, of course, there's got to be money involved. Interestingly, no one that we're aware of has taken a close forensic look at where the money's coming from and where it's going. And that's why we're so delighted to see research done by our next guest, Chris Moritz, who's a longtime investment banker and policy guy, has done on this question. Transgenderism. It didn't happen by accident. Some people are profiting from it. And with that, we introduce our guest who joins us here on set. Thank you.
Thank you, Tucker. It's beyond a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're grateful to have you. And there's been a lot of complaining about this. It's clearly a destructive trend that's hurting people, particularly children, destabilizing the society, and it doesn't make any sense. So it's making all of us irrational. But for some reason, nobody has taken the time to figure out who's profiting from this. And you've done what I think is a spectacular dive into this, an amazing overview of the economics of transgenderism. So with that, I'll just kind of back off and let you describe what you found.
Well, I think there's so many elements to this issue.
Yes.
Philosophical, religious even.
Yes.
Religious sociological.
Especially.
Of course.
Yeah.
But the economics of it, what I call transgender ink, is something that has gotten very, very little attention, and it deserves to be highlighted in a very visible way.
Yes.
Because this is a market that in 2018, this market is made up of sex reassignment surgeries and hormone replacement therapies, which include a number of different pharmaceutical products. But the combined value sales of sex reassignment surgeries and the pharmaceutical products in 2018 was $2.94 billion. By 2022, that figure had rose to $4.18 billion. And by 2030, our analysis indicates that would increase to $7.5 billion, which represents an 8.5% compound annual growth rate, which is relatively significant within a healthcare vertical.
Well, it's bigger than the entire healthcare budgets of some African countries.
For sure.
It's a lot of money.
Well, considering also that the population of patients is about 1 million people. There's 1.6 million transgender adults, or I should say over the age of 13, transgender individuals in the United States as of 2022. Now, that number has doubled in 10 years. So in 2011, there were 700,000 transgender Americans over the age of 13. And by 2022, that had risen to 1.6 million. Now,
so you just ended the debate over whether this is something a person is born with.
Well, I think that there is absolutely zero scientific evidence that would suggest that there is a gene, chemical alteration, any kind of somatic, physical, biological element to transgenderism that would result in what has become known as gender dysphoria. And in fact, if we get deeper into the medical research, we find that there are no clinical studies, none, on the long-term efficacy, consequences, and in many cases debilitating life-term effects of these procedures and pharmaceutical products, especially on children.
Were there no studies?
There are none. In fact, the FDA has not approved a single pharmaceutical product used in gender transition specifically for gender transition. So testosterone, estrogen, and what are called GnRH agonists or puberty blockers are all prescribed off-label. So they do not have specific FDA approval for gender transition because this is such a new field of medicine. Many of these drugs, especially these GnRH agonists or puberty blockers, have been traditionally prescribed for cancer patients.
Right.
And
prostate cancer, famously.
Exactly. So there's a drug called Lupron developed by AbbVie Pharmaceuticals. And this has gotten a lot of controversy and a lot of attention because in Texas, Ken Paxton has actually brought a suit against AbbVie and another pharmaceutical company that makes puberty blockers called Endo Pharmaceuticals, based on the fact that they are advertising to children these drugs off-label.
For a non-FDA approved use.
Correct.
So testosterone feeds prostate tumors.
Yes.
So if you are diagnosed with prostate cancer, one of the therapies might be to lower your testosterone, correct?
Correct.
That's what this drug is used for.
That's exactly right.
But it's now being prescribed at scale to kids.
Yeah.
And there's no study suggesting the outcomes long-term?
None. No peer-reviewed studies.
Can you think of is there any other part of, air quotes, medicine where over 1 million people are being prescribed a course of, quote, therapy where we don't know the outcome?
Yeah, I think there is an analogy that can be made. As a millennial growing up in the 90s, what was a big trend at that time in for that cohort? ADHD.
Yeah.
Everyone was put on Adderall at a young age because school teachers identified hyperactive kids, and the process of going from being identified as maybe a little different or whatever at the school level, and then getting elevated to guidance counselors, then to psychologists, then to clinicians, and before you know it, you're prescribed a very powerful pharmaceutical drug. And I think something very similar.
An addictive drug that'll give you brain damage.
For sure. And I'll tell you that drugs that are being administered for transgender patients, especially these puberty blockers, are far more dire.
Can we just back up
for
1 second? So, and I remember that very well. I had kids in school at the time. The ADHD thing happened. And I always thought it was a cope for, boring teachers teaching pointless material. And when kids got jumpy, they're like, you need drugs.
Right.
But I always assumed there was some sort of longitudinal research on the effects of this. And there was.
Well, at the time, at that time, it was still kind of a novel, a novel therapy, and really gained, enormous amount of traction in the 90s. And I think what we're seeing.
But they had no data to show that this would improve long-term outcomes.
I can't say whether there were peer-reviewed studies at the time. I believe that even today we don't know the long-term consequences necessarily of some of those specific drugs, but certainly with respect to the transgender pharmaceuticals, there are no long-term studies peer-reviewed that show the efficacy or not of taking these very powerful pharmaceuticals. And we may not know for some time. And in fact, has resulted in, this has resulted in a situation where clinicians and institutions and academics and elementary schools and the entire gamut of this supply chain have to fall back on protocols established by an organization called WPATH. WPATH stands for the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. It's technically a medical professional body established in the 1970s. But I think what's unique about it is that it is for sure, a medical entity, but it is also an advocacy organization. And
a political advocacy organization.
For sure. So insofar as they are advocating for the advancement of transgenderism. So, in other words, the protocols and clinical protocols that health systems, large and small, are falling back on are the standards that WPATH has enacted over the years.
So, can I ask you, pause for one second? So, in order for all of these therapies to become mainstream, you have to change the definition of gender dysphoria from something that you treat, a problem, a psychiatric illness. You have to change it from that to something very different.
In fact, the clinical history shows just that. So in 1952, the first sex reassignment surgery happened, I believe at Johns Hopkins, with a patient named Christine Jorgensen. It was very big news at the time. Then about 10 years later, Johns Hopkins established the first gender clinic for purposes of performing sex reassignment surgeries. But for most of the 20th century and certainly the post-war period, transgenderism, or gender dysphoria as it's become known, was deemed to be a mental illness. It was called transsexualism or gender identity disorder. This was kind of the basis for understanding treatment, and it was deemed to be psychiatric. However, in 2013, the American Psychiatric Association amended DSM. DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness.
Yes.
And in this change, they altered the nomenclature of the condition, such that transsexualism or gender identity disorder became gender dysphoria. And what's significant about this change...
So this is why the term transsexual, which was the term of art that people used, all people on all sides of the question, has disappeared.
Of course. And well, I mean, let's face it. If you remove the pharmaceuticals, if you remove the surgeries, what are you left with? You're left with a transvestite.
Right.
You're left with a cross-dresser.
Right.
And that's it. And that's what it was for decades and decades. I mean, there were, like I said, some surgeries here and there, very small numbers, but really what we're seeing today accelerated after 2010.
But I think most people, if I can interject, didn't feel as threatened by that, or threatened at all, speaking for myself, because the stakes are low.
Yeah.
You put on different clothes, it's an eccentric hobby of yours, or whatever it is,
right.
But you're not defacing your body, you're not stopping the natural process of maturation.
Right.
Right?
So by defining this condition as gender dysphoria, what it effectively achieved was removing the notion that this is a psychosexual disorder, and that is in fact a conflict between a subjective, self perception of gender, or even a social perception of gender, and one's natural feelings about gender, and
right.
Therefore that can be that distress that comes from the discontinuity between those two can be alleviated by surgeries and these very radical pharmaceuticals.
So I feel like I was born in the wrong body. Through plastic surgery and drugs, I can eliminate all of the anxiety that comes from feeling like I'm trapped in my own
I
body?
mean, that is the argument, and certainly for many like transgender patients, they report positive benefits from the process. However, many also report regret, severe physical ailments that come from the surgeries themselves, which we can get into, and the complications that arise from those, and then of course the pharmaceuticals.
Well, let's get into that if we could, because
Sure.
I spent, I don't know, the last 5 years talking about transgender stuff on TV, and debating people on it, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe what exactly the surgeries are. I don't think you're allowed to ask. I haven't Googled for photographs because I'm not sure I want to see them, but that's like not part of the conversation. Like the details have kind of been omitted here. So what are the surgeries?
They're purposely omitted.
So, well, okay, so let's get specific and turn this off if it bothers you.
No. For instance, I think probably one of the most graphic and invasive procedures is called a vaginoplasty, and that is where a male to female patient is castrated, testicles are removed, the penis is inverted to create a vaginal cavity, and then skin grafting is used to create other elements of female genitalia, vulva, labia, etc. But what we found is that there was a study from California.
They can't even do lip filler in a convincing way in this country. You can't tell me they can recreate something as complex as female genitalia. I'm sorry.
Of course they can. And there's a study out of California of 869 vaginoplasty patients. And of those 869, 25% post-op had side effects to the surgery that were so severe that they required additional hospitalization. Of those
25%.
Yes, and of those 25%, 44 had to have major revisional surgery due to bowel injuries, bleeding. Also associated with this particular procedure is total loss of sensation, in other words, sexual functioning.
Total loss.
Total loss, irreversible. So that's one of the, I think the more, one of the more explosive of these procedures. But it also includes mastectomies, which are performed at increasingly rate on minors, on girls. Even the Biden administration has kind of tacitly endorsed genital reconstructive surgery for minors on a case-by-case basis. This was promulgated by, I believe, Admiral Levine, Rachel Levine. Oh,
the dude in the military outfit.
Sure.
But can I ask, so like 10 years ago, again, just having spent life in cable news, I remember all the debates. And you sort of wonder, like, whatever happened to that? Like the female genital mutilation, FGM. This was something that your garden variety NPR donor was very upset about.
Sure.
Like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody mention female genital mutilation in the United States in quite some time now. Is that because we now officially engage in it?
Of course, we export it to the rest of the world. The rest of the developed world, which were, in fact, the Scandinavian countries in particular had prior in the early 2000s and in the 90s even, were really at the forefront of this field of medicine.
I thought it was the Muslims who had these crazy radical ideologies and they were exporting female genital mutilation, and now it's the West?
Actually, in Iran, Iran is one of the largest centers for sex reassignment surgery in the world.
What?
Yeah, because they're anti-gay. And transgenderism, I mean, it's a very quietly held but widely held view, I think, amongst the LGB community. The transgenderism is anti-LGB.
Well, of course it is.
Of course it is. And in Iran, where homosexuality is illegal, they have a very simple solution: vaginoplasty.
Cut it off?
Yeah. So,
well, you just blown my mind. I had no idea.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I'll tell you, in terms of the pace of growth for, let's say, clinics serving pediatric patients on gender issues. In last 15 years in the United States, we had 0 now to over 100
clinics
for kids.
Why?
It's a very complicated. It's a very complicated question, and there's a lot of different reasons why. I would say that the biggest single policy catalyst for this explosion is Obamacare. When Obamacare was enacted in 2010, there was a kind of very quietly kind of written into the law a provision in which insurance companies were mandated to provide coverage for what is deemed to be medically necessary gender-affirming care. As a result of that, between 2010 and 2016, there was a 50% increase in sex reassignment surgeries, 25% increase in insurance coverage for transgender individuals. And then at the very end of the Obama administration, 2016, an additional amendment to the Affordable Care Act was made whereby gender identity could no longer be a basis for denial of coverage by private insurance companies. As a result of that, the next year, from 2016 to 2017, there was a 150% increase in sex reassignment surgeries in the United States. The Trump administration, very early on, revoked this provision. And then, of course, the Biden administration put it back in place, I think, within the first 100 days.
So they're required to pay for it. How expensive is it?
Well, a total transformation, or a transition rather, for male to female is approximately $142,000.
And what does that entail?
That would entail what's called bottom surgery and top surgery.
So that would be castration, fake non-functional vagina, and breast implants.
Exactly.
But that does not, I mean, this is it's almost too crazy.
It's perverse.
Can I just ask a question? Does anyone study the sex lives of post-op transsexuals? Like, how are they?
Well, as I said, for many patients that have, especially the male to females that have procedures, genital reconstruction procedures, they face a lifetime of zero sexual function because they lose sensitivity, in this artificial vagina.
What about constructing an artificial penis? Are they better at that?
That seems to be more efficacious because it involves
less complicated.
Well, it's less complicated. It's also part of the process of let's say administering testosterone to women results in an enlargement of the clitoris.
Yes.
And that can be used as a basis to create a neophallus. So that's one procedure. That costs about $50,000. That can actually cost up to $150,000, depending on the health system, but it's generally about $50,000.
So in that specific case, since we know that testosterone and estrogen too, these are really powerful chemicals, and they're implicated in all kinds of health. They're necessary, but they're implicated in health disorders like cancer, but others as well. If you pump a man full of estrogen or a woman full of testosterone, like, what are the health consequences of that? Leaving aside sex identity.
Again, we have no long-term studies on the long-term effects of these pharmaceuticals on transgender patients. There's simply none. So clinicians fall back on guidelines established by WPATH.
By a transgender political group.
Yes. This is a very interesting anecdote about WPATH. There was a clinical psychologist at UCSF who is the U.S. chapter president of WPATH, and she is transgender. And in 2000, I believe 2021, she made a public statement that she believed that the industry was moving way too fast, and there was sloppy medicine and propensity for false positives in adolescence, resulting in potentially irreversible changes for these kids. As a result of this statement, WPATH forced her to resign and then issued a moratorium on all of its board members from ever speaking to the press.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's not science.
No.
But you have to wonder about just your garden variety physician who is swimming in this soup funded by the insurance companies, led by the nose by activist groups like WPATH and Human Rights Campaign, et cetera. And the effect is like scary medicine that's destroying people's lives. Like, where are all the doctors standing up and saying, whoa, that's not science, this is bad for people? I don't ever see them. Where are they?
In this country, they're hard to find. In other countries, which actually have longer histories of this kind of treatments and product lines, there's a significant pushback. In fact, in England, the leading pediatric clinic for gender dysphoria, it's called the Tavistock Clinic, was shut down by the NIH, which is the UK health system, health administrator, because of again, sloppy diagnoses, concerns that doctors were neglecting their duty of care, informed consent, and so it's opening up potential tort litigation.
But it does seem like, I mean, we have tens of thousands of physicians in this country, and they're all well-educated and by definition smart, and you'd like to think they're responsible and ethical. But it seems like they've been so corrupted. Like, how could they stand by and allow this to happen?
Well, how can they go on TikTok and Instagram and advertise specifically to targeted transgender youth that are following these feeds and promoting their services? Is that medicine or is that retail medicine? Right?
So I want to ask you about the economics in a minute, but I'm struck by the moral corruption.
Of course.
And wondering, I mean, there are a lot of crappy talk show hosts out there, and I always felt like, well, I'm a talk show host, I should probably say something. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like, because it's embarrassing. But I don't hold anyone's life in my hands. If I was a doctor, it feels like there's a moral obligation to say something. So this is a gender-affirming surgeon. This is a lunatic with a knife called Steve Gallagher, describing a brand new group of patients. Watch this.
A group of gender diverse individuals who haven't been very visible are eunuchs, and there's an entire chapter devoted to these folks in the most recent version of the WPATH Standards of Care. WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. And so basically a eunuch is somebody who's assigned male at birth but may not be comfortable with the masculine features and may also benefit from gender affirmation care, which could mean orchiectomy in some patients. Now, we have to be very careful because we know that if we just take away sex hormones completely, patients can have problems with osteoporosis and cardiovascular disease. So usually the patient will supplement on either low-dose testosterone or low-dose estrogen, and it requires specialized care. But sometimes this is an important part of gender affirmation surgery for this group of patients.
So just in case you're wondering if this is medieval, here you have apparently a physician proudly creating eunuchs, presumably to guard the harem somewhere.
Exactly.
I mean, what? So, but like, where are all the other surgeons who are like, wait, that's fully crackpot? That's pre-science?
There is definitely a pushback, but institutions are crushing that dissent.
That's what it is.
Just
right?
like what I cited with the clinical psychologist at who's the WPATH.
No, that's what it is.
U.S. chair.
It's the institute. It's like everyone watched the 2020 election get stolen, but nobody can say anything because you'll get crushed.
Look, and it's not just healthcare institutions. It's not just health systems. It's not just pharmaceutical companies. It's corporate America. So, for instance, there is an entity called the Tawani Foundation. The Tawani Foundation is led by Jennifer Pritzker, who is the transgender sister of Governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker. And she established a nonprofit entity called the Tawani Foundation, and then a private equity vehicle called Tawani Enterprises. Tawani Foundation has established grants all over the world to propagate transgenderism at the university levels, funding legal legal battles and legislative initiatives, but they have also partnered with corporate entities. So, for instance, in 2013, Tawani, in conjunction with Wells Fargo Foundation, established a grant at UC Santa Barbara to study transgenderism in the U.S. military.
To study transgenderism in the U.S. military.
Promote.
So can you tell me what you think the motive is in corporate America getting behind something so obviously destructive?
Well, I think that, as you have opined many, many times, corporate America gets their marching orders from HR departments. HR departments get their marching orders from universities. Universities are, we know what the culture and mores are of our elite institutions. And even these medical associations and boards, WPATH included, have strong affiliations with universities. These ideas are coming out of universities. And why that is, there's many reasons why. I would argue it's a kind of extension of postmodernist cultural Marxism, because transgenderism, if we're looking at it philosophically, is ultimately about rejecting what is a foundational principle, philosophical principle in Western civilization, which goes back to Aristotle, that there is such a thing as objective truth and reality.
Yes.
But transgenderism
and beauty.
Yes, but transgenderism is to say there is no such thing as an objective reality that you are born a male or female. It is your subjective perception of your gender identity that is actualized and made real, and where it becomes kind of authoritarian as a movement in the fact that the movement demands society recognize that subjective reality as truth. And I feel that that is one of the most disturbing things about this entire movement. They've created an entire lexicon that is, for instance, gender affirming care. What does that mean? What does it mean to be assigned a sex at birth, as it's often referred to in the literature? One argument can be made, it's very anti-God, right? It is, you are assigned a gender, and that can be changed by medical science.
Because you're God.
Right.
It also looks a lot like human sacrifice to me. I mean, castrate your sons, and you'll somehow benefit. I mean, most people, I would say, throughout, as long as people have existed, kind of want their children to reproduce and sort of carry on the line. That's like the core human desire. And this ends it. I mean, you castrate your son, you have no grandchildren.
Yeah, but why are parents agreeing to this? They're doing so because, and there are many anecdotes related to this in across the literature and across a lot of investigative journalists' reports on this subject, is that parents are presented, especially at that initial meeting with at a gender clinic with a choice. They'll say, you can either, your son can either be a daughter or you can have a dead son.
Right.
And they will scare the hell out of them with statistics about suicide rates and all sorts of other mental illnesses that will, suggestively come to fruition if you do not take this course of action. Ironically, in Sweden, which was really at a leader, in this area of medicine and in this field. A Swedish study about a couple of years ago found that post-op transgender patients have a significantly higher likelihood of making suicide attempts and requiring inpatient psychiatric care than the overall general population.
Is it only the white countries that are doing this, or are the non-white countries that are super anxious to castrate their kids?
Well, I can tell you it's not happening in China.
Right.
It's not happening in Japan. It's not happening in India. In Thailand, they have long had a cultural concept of like a third sex.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of, in fact, it's a big market for sex change surgeries.
And for sex trafficking.
Yeah, and for sex trafficking too. So, but
what about sub-Saharan Africa?
I mean, they certainly have, I think a strong market share on the genital mutilation subsegment. But in terms of transgenderism, I think that's a non-starter. This is an American export at this point.
Yeah, but it's the Anglosphere too, and Scandinavia, and so it's Western Europe, the United States.
But in England, they're pulling back from this as well. There are a number of important tort cases centered around negligence by doctors when it comes to duty of care and informed consent for transgender youth.
So just back to the money, which I've given short shrift to, my apologies. So who's profiting? You bring your 8th grader into a gender clinic, kid's got to transition or else he's going to kill himself. Who makes money going forward?
Well, Cedars-Sinai Hospital Health System in Los Angeles is the market leader in the sex reassignment surgery, U.S. sex reassignment surgery market. They have approximately 8% market share. It's highly fragmented overall. No single entity really has a share greater than 8%. So, these are very often regional and highly competitive space, but regional. And Cedars has a dedicated transgender clinic. The revenue from the surgeries brought on by that clinic in 2022 amounted to over $200 million. That is on revenue of I believe $8 billion for Cedars overall.
Cedars doesn't have a board, or there's no oversight of this?
The board encourages it. In fact, there are very perverse incentives for health systems to go full on board with this line of service and this line of products, because entities like the Human Rights Campaign have established what is essentially ESG for trans. They call it HEI, Health, Equity, Inclusion. So Human Rights Campaign about 15 years ago established this national benchmarking tool, and it effectively is a equity and inclusion gauge for health systems. And it is used coercively. And examples of that would be that in 2020, the Children's National Hospital received a low HEI score. And as a result of that, the board of directors of the hospital immediately established a DEI subcommittee and then extended sex reassignment surgery coverage to all of their employees and their dependents under the age of 18. The next year, Children's National Hospital received 100% HEI score.
But it's a hospital filled with self-described scientists. Nobody's piped up and said, there's zero evidence this is a good idea. We don't have a single study suggesting this works. No one said that?
Well, I mean, there's certainly studies that would show that, and again, like, they're not necessarily peer-reviewed, but there's studies that show that transgender patients are sometimes very satisfied with results. But on the other hand, many times they're not.
Over what period?
Well, I mean, that's a great question too, because
I mean, if you take a 17-year-old and pump him full of hormones he wasn't born with, like, there have to be massive physical and psychological consequences.
Well, okay, so with puberty blockers in particular, which suppress testosterone in men, in particular for prostate cancers, as you cited, and affect the pituitary gland, and suppress the onset of puberty. This was also developed to address what's called precocious puberty.
Right.
So, that would be kids
Early
let's say,
onset,
6-9 years old who start developing early, and this is what it's administered for. But the long-term effects of these drugs, especially in basically healthy patients, and let's face it, transgender patients do not necessarily have any other comorbidities or medical problems. They're healthy adults. It's in the mind, that results in the initiation of treatment. And in the case of puberty blockers, you have concern even amongst gender clinicians that brain development may be significantly impacted by the administration of these drugs, because if you suppress natural maturation, that includes brain development at a very critical stage in adolescence. So we have, that's a side effect. There's concerns about bone density. There's certainly concerns about long-term fertility rates. It goes on and on and on.
You said there are two big manufacturers of puberty blockers?
Well, there's several. The leading pharmaceutical players in this space include Pfizer, a company called AbbVie Pharmaceuticals.
Pfizer? What does Pfizer make?
Pfizer makes testosterone, estrogen, and puberty blockers. Primarily, though, it's testosterone and estrogen. And I want to stipulate that the overall sales for these product lines within the pharmaceutical companies are relatively small, because the number of patients is very small. There's 300,000 transgender youth, so 13 to 17 in the United States. That number has, by the way, doubled over 5 years, from 2017 being 150,000 to 300,000 by 2022. So these pharmaceutical companies are not necessarily making huge amounts of money off of these drugs. I think really the big money is coming from health systems and the surgeries, because they're just so expensive, and incorporate obviously a lot of ancillary costs related to surgeries in general. As I said, revision surgeries are a frequent issue with transgender sex reassignment, because they're just so invasive and so complicated. It takes 12 to 18 months to recover from a vaginoplasty or a phalloplasty.
Knowing as much as you do about how this began and who's profiting, if you wanted to stop it or slow it down, or make it less likely that your 8th grader wants to transition, what would you do?
Well, I think that when you're talking about an 8th grader, for instance, who exhibits, let's say, strong feminine qualities at an early age, may very well just be gay. But in the kind of the time that we live in now, that 8th grader is scrutinized by, a 8th grade teacher, identified as potentially gender dysphoric, referred to a guidance counselor, who then refers to a local psychologist, who then refers the 8th grader and his parents to a gender clinic. Go to the gender clinic, and a clinician will make a very stark assessment and raise the stakes for these parents, saying, you can have, again, as I said, a dead son or a transition daughter. And there was a study that Reuters did last year of 18 pediatric clinics, gender clinics in the U.S., and to assess basically the process of evaluation. They came to the following conclusion. Effectively, patients will meet with a social worker, a psychologist, and a clinician, either a pediatrician or an endocrinologist. They'll take a 2-hour meeting, assess medical history, talk about the benefits and risks and so on and so forth, present these suicide statistics. And Reuters found that 7 of these 18 clinics would, after they were made sure there was no obvious red flags or comorbidities, and that the child and parents were in agreement, which I think is interesting. The child would be in agreement to this equally with the parents. Then out of these 7 clinics, they are comfortable after this 2-hour meeting, after a first meeting, to make a gender dysphoria diagnosis and prescribe these powerful pharmaceuticals.
Any idea what percentage of the families were single parent, female headed?
I don't know that. It's a good question.
It's hard to imagine too many dads going along with this, but maybe we're that degraded.
But in California recently, there was legislation that can effectively take custody away from let's say, a dad who objects to the gender affirmation of their kid.
Yeah, well, that's just stealing your child.
And to what end?
It's just interesting. I mean, it's a passive country that nobody's resorted to violence. I mean, in a normal culture, if someone said we're going to take your child away and castrate him, I mean, you would die before you let that happen.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think that so much of this has to be viewed in parallel with the radicalization that happens at the primary school level and at university school level. Frankly, Elon Musk has talked about his own experience with this at a elite private school in Los Angeles, where his daughter, or son, became kind of politically radicalized and then transitioned, and you'll find, I think, that the political radicalization and the gender radicalization are both coming from the universities, and they both have the same end goals, which is to break down the foundations of our country and of our civilization as we have established for millennia, to replace it with something new in their image, and it is a kind of playing God, and it's a kind of cultural revolution that I think even has some parallels to the China's Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, which seems a little bit less absurd than this. Just saying.
Oh, in many ways.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for all of this.
Thank you,
all of the
Tucker.
research you did, and
Thank
for
you.
so clearly explaining it. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Thank you.